All right, welcome everybody to another video tutorial. Today we are going over the tools or the installations needed uh, for the mobile development course. There's quite a lot involved with getting the development environment set up. So I figured in conjunction or in addition rather to the setup instructions that are found on Blackboard, just right here, I'm going to make a video streamlining things, okay? So if we look at the setup instructions available on Blackboard, I've kind of broken them down into steps. And the first step here is we have to install the Flutter SDK. So if we visit that link, we should have, let me just copy that link, throw that in the browser. And we kind of have steps already to get things set up that I've broken down in the setup instructions. Okay, so the first things first is we do need to download the latest SDK, software development kit for Flutter. Keep in mind an SDK will have things like software libraries, APIs, documentation, pretty much the whole framework for Flutter is in the SDK. So we have to download the latest stable version, and you can see it's 3.13.9. And there's a little configuration involved, and that was the reason why I've made this video, because there's some intricacies rather along the way. So let's get into it. So we download the latest SDK. I will caution people that these files, especially Android Studio SDKs, they can be quite large. So just make sure you have enough room in your system to accommodate these files. If you have, for example, a lot of pictures or videos, you might want to consider getting rid of some of them if they're filling up your storage capacity. Okay, so we have the zip, assuming we've downloaded it. There's a specific spot we need to put it, and that is in the user root. If you want to figure out where that is, we're going to hit the Windows icon and just put in CMD, and that will bring up the command prompt. Okay, so we should already be in the root folder here. So you'll see the C folder, the users, and then your username specific to your computer, whatever you set it up as or whatever you log in as. This is the directory where we want to install Flutter, the Flutter SDK. So when you go to the zip and you want to unpack it, because you have to unpack the zip, you want to do it in this folder, okay? So where we can see it, okay? So when you do unpack the zip, just make sure it's unpacked in your respective user root folder. Okay, and after that, I've already done that, but just make sure you're following the instructions. We actually have to change some environment variables, okay? So again, we hit the Windows icon and we punch in ENV, okay, and enter. And what this gives us is a systems property window. We're actually going to go down to the bottom right and hit this environment variables, and this will bring up the environment variables window. Essentially, what we're doing at this step is we're pointing to our Flutter installation so Windows can find it. Okay. So what we need to do is find path in this list and double click on it. Okay, it might appear differently as far as the value, but that's okay. Just make sure you double click on path. And we're actually creating a new path manually. So it would be exactly like this here. So we have the C drive, /users, your username or system name, /flutter, /bin. So we're actually pointing to the bin file. Okay, so create a new one. make sure it points to the bin file, and make sure to hit OK at the end, and just go back in there and just double check that it is in there. Okay. What this allows essentially is once we've unpacked the SDK, we'll be able to use it, the Flutter Doctor, in the command prompt. Okay. There are additional steps here, like where Flutter Dart. You can kind of troubleshoot some items if you can't find it, but again, it should be in the path that we've specified. Okay. Next up is we're running the Flutter Doctor command. So once the SDK is in our directory, we're just going to hit Flutter Doctor. And what this does, it's a command line interface tool. It ensures that we have everything we need to install or start developing with Flutter. Okay, and so if we look at the top here, line by line, we'll go through. We have Flutter. Okay, the latest SDK. I have the version here. Next up is the Windows. So it requires version 10 or higher, and I'm at Windows 11. And next in the list is the Android toolchain. Okay, so we are, for the purposes of this course, focusing on Android emulation. Flutter is cross-platform, so we're able to compile into both operating systems, iOS and Android. But we do use the Android emulator. But students can connect their physical iPhones to their laptops and use that for emulation or UI changes. Back to this. At this point, we actually need to install Visual Studio, Android Studio, because this will give us access to a few things. Okay, so this is a large file. Just download the latest build. And it's going to be a little bit to unpack, so please have patience there. Next up, once you have everything installed, I have it ready to go. I'm just going to launch it. Some configurations and further installations we need to do from within Android Studio, and this is outlined in step 4. I've kind of skipped ahead a little bit, but as long as you get everything completed, you're fine. Okay, so the first step once you have Android Studio is to go to the SDK Manager, and it'll automatically choose this Android SDK, which is fine. We're actually going to go to the submenu here called SDK Tools and click on that. And basically, we want to select these items here, about 5 in total. So first up is the Android SDK Build Tools 34. Next, Android SDK Command Line Tools, the latest. Definitely need that. Android Emulator Hypervisor Driver, and then Android SDK Platform Tools. So we want all 5 of those, and we're going to hit Apply, and then OK. So I have these installed already, but those who haven't are going to kind of go through an installation process, and it will take time. Again, you will need to have patience with that. Okay, so once you're all done, you're good to go there. Next up is we actually have to go back to Tools, and instead of SDK Manager, let's go to Device Manager. And here's where we actually install our emulation devices. So basically, when we develop in Flutter, we're actually running an Android operating system or iOS operating system on our computers, in addition to the Windows environment. So that could be quite taxing on computing resources like RAM and CPU. But you can see here on the right side, I have a Pixel C resizable container that I can use and another resizable. So basically, you would create a device and go down the list. I like to pick from the top. This resizable is pretty good, but you can choose Pixel or Android devices to your liking. Just make sure it's not too small. And these are actually quite large as well, so just be prepared for that. We do have another tab called Physical, and you can see a pair using Wi-Fi. I've actually left a link in the instructions at the bottom here how to, this bottom link, if you visit it, it will lead you to this screen. And Android kind of details how to set up a physical device instead of using emulation tools, okay? So we use Android Studio to get all the SDKs and the emulator, hypervisor, the drivers, things like that, but we actually code with VS Code. So we need, if you don't already have a VS Code, make sure you download it at visualstudio.com. They have a subdomain code here, and you can just download the latest build, okay, for Windows 64-bit. All right. In addition to this, so Visual Studio Code, Android Studio, Flutter SDK, we actually need Visual Studio. And the reason is because it uses a C++ item in Visual Studio to actually compile the code. So it uses the engine. So we have to download Visual Studio. Oh, that's the code. Just make sure it's the actual Visual Studio, okay? I would just do the community one because we're not enterprise or professional. Just download the community. That should be free. And again, this could be a larger download. So we definitely need this item here as well. And I can't stress this enough. Visual Studio is actually different than Visual Studio Code. This is a lightweight editor. Visual Studio is a full-blown IDE, but we do need that for compilation. So make sure you have this installed as well, okay? All right, so now that we have the Android tool chain, we have Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio IDE, we can open up Visual Studio Code and now do a few things. So once you have your emulators installed, you'll notice that, well, you won't notice it right away. Basically, what we need to do in Visual Studio is go to the Extensions tab, and I have these pre-installed, but you're going to have to find a few items here. One is Android iOS, it's emulator, and it should be right at the top. Just click on it. I have it installed, but this button will actually say install, and just click on it, install it. Boom, you're good to go. There are some settings we need to change. So as soon as it's installed, just hit this setting icon and go down to extension settings. And there's two paths that we need to set up. One is the emulator path. So this is where the emulator is actually installed, and this is in the Android subfolder. And you can see as long as you copy this path, you should be fine. There's another path we need to define here, and it has to look like this. So you notice here we have a little bit difference. We have 2 backslashes for each one in the C drive. So users, whatever your system name or username is, app data local Android SDK emulator. So basically you want to copy this exact path and only change this bit where your username is going to be different, okay, or your system name. And then make sure this is saved. So those 2 items here, again, this is in the instructions. I have outlined kind of the syntax here for the instructions or the directory, okay, path. All right, so once that's saved, Android iOS emulator should be ready to go. Just close down VS Code and restart it. And you'll notice this button at the top right here called emulator. Once you click on that, you can launch your emulators. You can cold boot. Cold boot just means you're basically starting the phone from power off. And I prefer this just because sometimes the emulator can hang and leave you on a screen. Things don't work once you start compiling code and want to see the UI. So just get in the habit of using the cold boot. It takes a little bit of time, but this is what the actual Android emulator looks like. Okay. If you've reached this point, great. If you haven't, just keep running Flutter Doctor. You could do it in the command line or in the terminal itself in VS Code. And any sort of items where there's a red X or an X that appears, you can troubleshoot the errors with Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is a big hub for developers who want to pose questions, answer questions. A lot of experts on there that have posed questions about Flutter, setting up Flutter, and you're bound to find what you need there. Okay, just do a quick Google search. You can see the phone has loaded and it operates just like a phone. There are commands here, but it is the full operating system. Okay, keep in mind once you have this open, it's going to start eating a lot of resources. Okay, especially when you start compiling and running code or an app. Okay, so we're all set up with the Android emulator. I'm going to close this now. There's two other items we need to set up, and one is in the extensions. We just need to search for Dart. Dart, this is language support, so you want to install this because, of course, Flutter uses Dart as its programming language, and we want to install the language support, so it will tell us, okay, well, what is the correct syntax in situations like that. Next, we want to install the Flutter support and debugger. Okay, so just click on that, install. I've already had these items pre-installed, but just click on the install button and get those things up and running for VS Code. What this allows for essentially is we can debug our code on the fly. It won't allow us to compile code if we have syntax errors or things that aren't correct in our code. Okay, so that's what those items allow us to do. Quick and easy installations here. Finally, we are looking, well, not finally, sorry, I jumped ahead there. If not already, you should have Git installed. This is the Windows client, the latest version of Git. The reason being is when we are developing, we're going to be committing our code to GitHub repositories, and it allows us to do that through the command line or through these buttons here as we go along. So just make sure you have Git installed, and that's git-scm.com, and it should be a quick installation there. Okay, lastly, and I just want to make sure we've covered everything. So we got, if we kind of recap what we've done so far, we've installed the Flutter SDK, we've changed the environment variables to point to the Flutter bin file. We've installed Visual Studio Code with the Dart language support, with the Flutter support and debugger. And we've also installed the Android iOS emulator with these paths, with these unique paths set or saved. Okay. We've installed a few things. So Visual Studio, in addition to Visual Studio Code, again, those are two different things that we need installed, and also Android Studio, which gives us access to all of these items here. So Android SDK build tools, command line tools, emulators, and platform tools. Okay, again, just run Flutter Doctor and just keep ensuring that you have all of these items and there's no issues found. That's when you know everything is ready to go. Okay, lastly, we have Firebase. So we do connect to Firebase. This is a cloud database created by Google, and it's a NoSQL database essentially. So we have collections, we have documents, just like MongoDB, and it allows us to do actually quite a bit more. We can set up our authentication without actually writing code. It's like a plugin. And all we really need in the code are some syntax and connection strings, and we're good to go. Okay, but Firebase Google through Firebase offers quite a quite a host of items that we can plug into our app, including Crashlytics, analytics, messaging, events, um, that sort of thing. Okay, so if you're having any issues, just go through it. You can rewind the video, troubleshoot some items, visit Stack Overflow. If you have any questions or run into any technical problems, you're bound to just with the setup process. This involved probably the more involved setup process we see as far as dev environments. But I hope you enjoyed, and thank you very much. We'll see you again.